Okay, let's unpack this. We are jumping straight into what a lot of historians consider, well, the most critical and, frankly, the most desperate 3 months of World War II in Europe. We're talking October through December 1944. This is a time when the Allied forces were, absolutely convinced they were on the home stretch.
They could see the finish line.
Exactly. But the fight that was about to unfold was, well, it was maybe the most brutal and strategically complex of the entire war. So if you're looking for a shortcut to understanding that real pivot point of the war, when logistics finally started to overcome ideology and when Hitler made his final, most irrational mistake, this is the deep dive for you. We're going to be synthesizing a whole stack of sources that cover these massive logistical choke points the Allies faced, the sheer savagery of the fighting on German soil, and how Hitler's paranoia just reached this fever pitch.
It really did. It compromised his entire strategic apparatus.
And you have to think about the contrast here. I mean, just 5 years earlier, Hitler was this image of invincibility, right? After storming through Poland and France. But by the fall of 44, the entire Axis position was completely compromised. And this pressure had been building like crazy ever since the United States got into the war after Pearl Harbor. So we're not here to rehash all the basics, but to see how those early events really fed into the desperation of this late war period.
That's the crucial pivot, really. Because the groundwork for this desperation in late 44 was laid by this series of just colossal Allied victories. They demonstrated a truly remarkable fighting spirit, as our sources put it.
Right.
We can't forget the sheer effort it took just to get the Allies to the borders of Germany in the first place.
Take North Africa, for example.
Exactly. I mean, look at North Africa. The turnaround in 1942 was critical. When General Bernard Montgomery was up against Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein, he wasn't planning for failure. He wasn't planning for retreat.
Yeah.
He took this incredibly bold, non-negotiable stance. He actually destroyed all the plans for withdrawal. He was effectively telling his troops, and a historian captured this quote, "If we cannot stay here alive, then we will stay here dead." That was the spirit. That's what it took to finally defeat the Desert Fox.
And then you look east, and the scale of the fighting there was just it was even more devastating for the Nazis. The failure of the Blitzkrieg meant the German military was just bleeding out on the Eastern Front long before D-Day.
Oh, absolutely. The disaster at Stalingrad in February 43, where the German Sixth Army was just completely destroyed. That was a foundational fracture for them.
And that wasn't a one-off, was it?
Not at all. Later that year, you had the Battle of Kursk. The failure of German armor there proved that the Blitzkrieg wasn't this invincible tactic everyone thought it was. So by the time D-Day hits in June of 1944, Hitler is fighting a massive war of attrition on two fronts. He's not thinking about conquest anymore.
He's just trying to survive.
It's all about survival.
Which brings us right to October 1944. The Allies had broken out of Normandy. They're pushing hard, but the fighting in the East is still just horrific.
I think we need to start there, with that external military collapse that was fueling all of Hitler's internal paranoia. So the Soviet Union's big summer offensive, Operation Bagration. This wasn't just a push, was it? This was, as historians describe it, the moment of Germany's catastrophic failure in the East.
Bagration was laser-focused. The aim was to shove the German forces, specifically Army Group Center, out of what's now Belarus and all the way back into Poland. But it's the sheer scale of the destruction that really defines this operation.
It wasn't a strategic withdrawal.
No. This was an annihilation. The sources, they really don't pull any punches. They call it one of the bloodiest operations known to man.
And the numbers are just staggering. It's not just a defeat. It was called the most calamitous defeat of all the German armed forces in World War II. The Red Army inflicted something like 670,000 casualties on the Germans. Just think about that number for a second. That's dead, wounded, and captured. This was a catastrophic hemorrhaging of German manpower, and it was happening right after the debilitating losses they'd suffered in Normandy.
So by October, the German army they can't replace these guys. Not with high-quality, trained soldiers.
They are stretched to the absolute breaking point, and you can imagine German civilian morale just plummeted. It hit an all-time low. And for Hitler, that loss of faith was completely unacceptable.
So if the military's failing, your world is crumbling, what does a dictator do to get control back?
He tries to convince everyone he's holding a trump card.
a secret weapon.
A secret weapon. And that is exactly why he chose this moment to unveil the V-1 missile campaign.
The vengeance weapon.
Precisely. The V-1, or Vergeltungswaffe-1. It was basically a flying bomb, an early cruise missile. They'd been developing it for years, but now they unleashed it primarily on London.
And the destruction was immediate.
Swift and immense. The terror was so acute it led to this mass evacuation of children from the capital. It was pure psychological warfare.
Designed to break the British will.
Absolutely. But strategically, it was just too little too late. The British defense was far more effective than the Germans ever realized. Of the, 2,452 V-1s they launched, the RAF managed to shoot down over a third of them.
And there's a key intelligence detail here.
A critical one. Because of a strict press blackout by the British government, the Germans had, and I quote, no idea how successful the attacks had been. They couldn't adjust their targeting. They didn't realize the impact wasn't nearly enough to force a surrender.
So the consensus is that the V-1 it came too late.
Far too late to really shift the momentum of the war.
And that failure in the sky, it just perfectly mirrors the terrifying failures happening inside the regime itself. While he's losing ground everywhere else, Hitler also has to worry about traitors in his own inner circle. The paranoia was hitting its peak in 1944.
It was a house of cards ready to collapse. I mean, we know there were multiple assassination attempts on Hitler that year, but the big one, the attempted military coup, Operation Valkyrie, on July 20th, that was the moment everything just fractured internally.
And the immediate plotters, like von Stauffenberg, they were hunted down and executed almost immediately. But the investigation that followed was just relentless, brutal.
It wasn't about justice, was it? It was a purge. It was designed to root out every single hint of dissent, and the net just kept getting wider and wider, pulling in some of the most respected military figures.
And the most shocking name to come up, without a doubt, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel.
This is just an astonishingly cynical political move. Rommel, the Desert Fox, he was maybe the most charismatic and well-known German hero on the world stage.
He was the face of the clean Wehrmacht, in the public eye at least.
Exactly. He represented the pure professional soldier, separate from the fanaticism of the Nazi Party. He fought hard in North Africa. Then he was in charge of defending the French coast. He was an icon.
And our sources are pretty clear that Rommel, personally, had some serious reservations about the Nazi regime, especially the treatment of Jewish people. But his actual involvement in the plot seems tenuous at best, right?
Very tenuous. I mean, think about the timing. Rommel had been hospitalized with severe head injuries from an air attack on July 17th. That's just 3 days before Valkyrie.
So he's recovering in a hospital bed when it all goes down.
Right. And while he's recovering, they find these documents at the conspirators' headquarters that list him as a potential supporter.
Yeah.
Maybe even a leader if the coup worked. But critically, there was no actual evidence. Nothing to show he'd ever communicated with them or actively participated.
So the case against him was basically just his known dissatisfaction with Hitler's command.
That was it. For that paranoid regime, recovering in a hospital and having expressed some doubts, well, that was enough to be branded a traitor.
But prosecuting a national war hero in a public court, especially when you are so clearly losing the war, is a massive PR disaster.
It's a huge risk. And that's where Martin Bormann, the head of the party chancellery, comes in. Bormann was convinced Rommel was guilty, and he pushed for him to face the notorious People's Court.
But Hitler knew better.
Hitler understood the optics. He couldn't risk a public trial where Rommel, this hero, might challenge the regime's authority. And he certainly couldn't risk executing a national icon in public.
So on October 14th, 1944, they gave him this unbelievably cruel ultimatum.
It is just an astonishingly cynical political calculation. Two Nazi officers show up at Rommel's home with this proposition. They offer him a choice, because he's a German hero.
Option 1?
Face Bormann in the People's Court, which means a show trial, immediate public disgrace, and the prosecution and probable execution of his entire family and his staff.
And option 2?
Take your own life.
Wow.
Poison. Do that, and your death will be reported as a patriot's. You'll get a full state funeral, and your family will receive your full pension.
That is the ultimate act of coercion, giving a man the choice between poisoning himself or watching his entire family get destroyed. What does that tell you about the fear inside that regime at that moment?
It tells you that preserving the myth of the regime was more important than anything else, more important than even its finest commanders. Rommel, of course, chose option 2 to protect his loved ones.
He says goodbye to his family.
A swift farewell. Leaves with the officers. And he's dead hours later. The public was told he died of a sudden heart attack, and they completed the whole charade with a full military funeral. This one event, sacrificing your greatest asset to crush internal dissent. It just shows you the terminal stage of paranoia that had seized the Nazi leadership.
So while Hitler is busy executing his own generals to maintain this illusion of control, the Allied advance in the West is facing a totally different, but just as fatal, enemy: logistics. Let's shift now to Section 2, the critical supply lifeline. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, but they were driving so fast across France and Belgium that their supply lines they couldn't keep up.
It's the classic problem of success.
Exactly. And the single biggest problem was a crippling fuel shortage. And that came directly from the fact that they didn't have a deepwater port capable of handling the colossal amount of supplies they needed for a final push.
And this crisis really came to a head in September with the ill-fated Operation Market Garden.
Ah, yes. Montgomery.
Field Marshal Montgomery, having just gotten that rank, was absolutely determined to launch this one single, swift advance across the Rhine into Germany from Belgium.
Even though Eisenhower wanted him to focus on something else first.
Right. General Eisenhower, looking at the big picture, had strongly advised him to prioritize capturing the deepwater port of Antwerp first. Ike knew you couldn't win the war without a stable supply chain, but Montgomery wanted this one glorious thrust.
Our sources describe him as always difficult to command, and he just went ahead with it anyway. He argued Eisenhower's strategy was too slow.
And Market Garden was one of the war's most ambitious gambles. The goal was to seize a series of bridges intact, paving this high-speed highway for tanks straight toward Berlin. You had Market, the airborne attack to grab the bridges, and Garden, the ground troops racing to meet them.
For that to work, the coordination had to be perfect.
Perfect. But the preparation was catastrophically rushed. I mean, operations like this usually took months of detailed planning.
And they did Market Garden in
just 1 week, with no rehearsal and almost no tactical training.
And this is where Montgomery's stubbornness just becomes fatal. He dismissed clear photographic evidence.
They are recon photos, showing menacing German tanks right near the landing zones. He just dismissed them as non-serviceable wrecks.
But they weren't.
They were absolutely serviceable.
And the outcome was, tragically, predictable. The logistics were lagging, planning was rushed, and the Germans had just enough time to consolidate and counterattack.
Montgomery was forced to withdraw after suffering around 20,000 Allied casualties. Precious time was lost, and the vital point was proven. Without a massive, steady supply route, the push for Berlin was completely stalled.
Which put the spotlight right back on Eisenhower's original priority, the port of Antwerp. The entire Allied position was threatened by this supply drought.
You can't run an army on ambition. You need millions of gallons of fuel and tons of ammunition every single day.
So the desperate, hard-fought Battle of the Scheldt begins on October 2nd. The port of Antwerp itself was secured pretty quickly, but that was not the end of the story, was it?
Not at all. This is a crucial point a lot of people miss. You can capture a port, but if the Germans still control the approach to it, you can't use it.
And the Scheldt estuary is a long, winding bottleneck.
Exactly. And the German 15th Army, they had retreated into that area and were dug in on Walcheren Island, overlooking the estuary, heavily fortified. They were an active threat to any incoming Allied ships. Until that island was cleared, Antwerp was completely useless.
So the entire logistical crisis for the Western Front hinged on a handful of entrenched German troops on a Dutch island.
Pretty much. And the task of clearing that area fell to the 1st Canadian Army, with support from British and Polish forces in what became Operation Infatuate.
And it was brutal.
Oh, a brutal amphibious operation. The area was heavily mined, the terrain was waterlogged, the German defenses were incredibly fierce. The preparatory bombardment started at the end of October. The Canadians landed on November 1st, forcing this head-on fight. The sources just detail the sheer tenacity of the German defense.
Fighting street by street, bunker by bunker.
For weeks. But slowly the Canadians cleared them out. By the end of November, over 40,000 German troops from the island and the surrounding area had surrendered. That marked a complete liberation of Belgium and, most importantly, it secured the waterway.
And that's the strategic so what of the whole thing.
That's it. The opening of the port of Antwerp, along with the capture of Marseille in the south, finally, definitively, ended that crippling supply shortage. The path for the final push into Germany was now logistically clear. The opening of Antwerp in late November was, you could argue, the single most important strategic victory of late 1944.
And while that logistical grind was happening in the West, we also saw some movement further south and east. For instance, the liberation of Athens in Greece. in October 44.
Right. The Germans had been occupying Greece since 1941, but with the Russians advancing so rapidly through Romania and Yugoslavia, the Germans had to strategically withdraw to avoid being completely cut off and trapped in the Balkans.
The whole region was a strategic and political mess.
A total mess. And you absolutely cannot talk about October in the East without dealing with one of the most controversial events of the entire war, the end of the Warsaw Uprising.
This was a desperate 64-day fight where Polish nationals, the Polish Home Army, fought to liberate their capital from the Germans. And their goal, part of this broader Operation Tempest, was to free Warsaw before the Soviets got there.
Right, so a non-communist Polish government could take control. But the ultimate tragedy here is Joseph Stalin's calculated betrayal.
The Red Army was right there.
Right there. Fresh off the success of Bagration, they were less than 10 kilometers away from the struggling Polish fighters. And then they were ordered to stop. The Soviets just sat there and watched and waited as the Germans moved in and ruthlessly crushed the uprising.
That feels like more than just a pause. The controversy in our sources is all about the speculation that Stalin did this deliberately. He let the Germans do his dirty work for him.
It's highly probable. I mean, the Polish Home Army was anti-communist. Stalin saw them as a political threat to his post-war plans for dominating Eastern Europe. By letting the Germans eliminate this opposition, he made sure that when the Soviets finally took Warsaw, there would be no one left to resist his puppet government. It was just cold, brutal, geopolitical calculation.
So while Warsaw burned, the Soviets were busy elsewhere. They launched the Debrecen offensive in eastern Hungary on October 6th. The goal there was to shatter the Axis defenses and open up a gateway into Germany from the south.
And the initial phase was ferocious. The Second Ukrainian Front just stormed past the Hungarian Third Army. But their progress eventually slowed down as the Germans managed to build up a strong defensive line.
And there's another grim note in the sources here about conduct.
Yeah, the Soviet troops treated Hungarian civilians with utter contempt. They committed atrocities that, ironically, galvanized the Hungarian and German troops, making them fight even harder to defend their homes.
So, despite the Soviet numbers, the Axis resistance was determined enough that the battle ended, as one source says, with the honors even.
A tactical victory for the Axis, you could say, but they couldn't hold the line forever. By November 4th, the Red Army had secured Budapest and the surrounding area, which put them in position for the final push later that winter.
Okay, so with logistics slowly getting sorted in the West and the Eastern Front grinding forward, let's move to Section 3. The grinding battles on German soil. The Allies were finally crossing the threshold, fighting the Germans in their homeland. And they found out very quickly this was a completely different and far more dangerous kind of war.
The psychological advantage just flips completely. When a soldier is fighting for his own city, his own soil, the level of resistance just increases exponentially. And our first brutal case study of this is the Battle of Aachen, which starts on October 2nd.
Aachen was hugely significant, the first major German city to be fought over on home soil. And the determination to defend it was fanatical. There's that incredible, tragic anecdote that just highlights Hitler's irrationality right before the battle.
Oh, yeah. During September, the German commander of Aachen, he realized his men were hopelessly outnumbered. So he makes this pragmatic decision and offers to surrender the city to the Americans, to save civilian lives.
But the letter detailing the surrender offer, somehow, it doesn't get to the Allies.
In a logistical mix-up, or maybe it was intentional, it bypasses Allied lines and gets delivered directly to Adolf Hitler.
And the consequence was predictable.
Immediate and predictable. The commander was instantly arrested as a traitor, and Hitler ordered massive German reinforcements into the city. He would rather see Aachen destroyed than surrendered.
So even though the Americans had almost a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower, the defense was just tenacious.
They used every single building, every pile of rubble, as a fortress. They held their lines for 3 brutal weeks. And when the Americans finally took the city on October 21st, the cost was horrific. Both sides lost around 5,000 men. A staggering exchange rate.
But as terrible as Aachen was, the fighting that really defined the brutal attrition of late 1944 wasn't a city siege. It was the vast, claustrophobic expanse of the Hürtgen Forest.
The Battle of Hürtgen Forest. It runs from September 44 right through to February of 45. It holds a really grim distinction. It became the longest-running battle on German ground in the war, and shockingly, the longest continuous battle in all of U.S. history.
And the objective for the Allies seemed simple, on paper at least. clear the Germans out of this heavily forested area on the border to stop them from reinforcing their main lines and to grab control of the Ruhr River dams.
But the Germans considered this territory absolutely vital. Why? Because the forest provided perfect cover for what Hitler was secretly planning.
Their den offensive.
The Battle of the Bulge. He needed this terrain as an unobserved staging ground for his final armored divisions.
And the fighting was just a pure nightmare.
It was. The U.S. 9th Infantry Division's initial attack on the town of Schmidt in early October. In just 11 days, they lost 4,500 American troops. It was this catastrophic warning that the Wehrmacht, despite everything, was far from broken.
And the terrain itself was the real enemy.
The ultimate killer. Hürtgen was an incredibly dense conifer forest. It restricted visibility, restricted movement. There were hardly any roads, so vehicles are almost useless. And worst of all, the dense tree canopy completely neutralized Allied air support.
Their biggest advantage.
Gone. They were fighting blind. And the Germans, who knew the land intimately, had preset their machine guns and mortars on the few trails that existed. They planted minefields everywhere, which were then hidden by the early winter snows.
The conditions must have been horrific.
Freezing, soaking, massive rates of casualties just from frostbite, trench foot, and sheer exhaustion.
I read that veterans who witnessed the slaughter on Omaha Beach on D-Day, they said that compared to Hürtgen Forest, Omaha had been a walk in the park.
That comparison just tells you everything you need to know about the psychological toll. Out of 120,000 American troops who fought in Hürtgen, 33,000 were killed, wounded, or incapacitated.
It was an incredibly costly victory, and the question is why? Given the massive attrition, Allied casualties were more than double the German losses. Why did Eisenhower let that meat grinder continue for so long?
It was really a confluence of factors, but it was mostly tied to those Ruhr River dams. The fear was that the Germans could, and probably would, open the dams to flood the entire valley, and that would stall the Allied advance across the whole front for months.
So controlling the dams was seen as a strategic imperative.
Exactly, to prevent a wider disaster. But the result was this horrific, bloody stalemate defined by attrition, where the Germans achieved a huge tactical success just by maximizing American casualties and delaying the Allied advance for several crucial months.
Okay, we've covered Rommel's death, the crisis at Antwerp, the grind of Hürtgen. Let's briefly zoom out now to Section 4. Global context and escalating terror. Because October 1944 was a pivotal moment, not just in Europe, but all the way across the Pacific.
While the Europeans were struggling through the mud and snow, the Americans were finally making significant headway against the Japanese. And this is the moment General Douglas MacArthur finally made good on his famous promise.
He'd been forced to leave the Philippines back in '42 when the Japanese overran them. He followed a direct order from Roosevelt to withdraw, but he made that legendary vow, "I shall return."
In return, he did. On October 20th, 1944, he wades ashore on the island of Leyte with his staff. It's one of the most iconic photos of the war, and it symbolized the beginning of the end for the Japanese occupation.
And the Japanese response was immediate and massive, leading to the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
This is a battle that, deserves its own deep dive, really. It's widely seen as the largest naval battle in the history of naval warfare. Nearly 200,000 personnel, hundreds of ships.
And the Allies secured a decisive victory.
A decisive victory. Led by Fleet Admiral William Halsey, the Americans essentially destroyed the Japanese Navy's ability to operate as an organized fleet. But what's fascinating, beyond just the scale, is the introduction of this terrifying new tactic by the Japanese.
The kamikaze.
Indeed. Leyte Gulf is noted for being subject to the first ever organized kamikaze bombings. This was the official deployment of suicide attack planes, a profound escalation of desperation and fanaticism. But even with that, the victory at Leyte Gulf meant the tide had definitively turned toward the USA in the Pacific.
So returning to Europe, even as the military situation was getting worse on all fronts, Hitler continued his policy of terror, moving from the V-1 to the V-2 missile.
The V-2 was something else entirely. They engineered fear. The V-1, the buzz bomb, at least it gave you a warning with its loud engine.
You could hear it coming.
You could hear it coming. The V-2 was silent, faster than the speed of sound, and its ballistic trajectory made it almost impossible for anti-aircraft guns to hit. The first warning you got was the explosion itself. Then you heard the sound barrier breaking moments later, just pure terror from above.
And we have to put the cost of this into perspective. This wasn't just a new weapon. It was an economic black hole for the Third Reich.
Oh, astronomical. The V-2 was the single most expensive project of the entire Third Reich. It cost 100,000 Reichmarks for every single rocket. And Hitler, clinging to this belief that technology could save him, ordered over 6,000 of them built.
And that economic cost, it pales in comparison to the human cost of its production. This is where the story gets incredibly dark.
The manufacturing of the V2 took place in these underground factories, and they were staffed by inmates from the Mittelbau-Dora slave labor camp. The sources record a chilling statistic. Some 20,000 workers lost their lives just during the production process.
20,000 people.
From the horrific conditions, disease, maltreatment, it is a staggering human sacrifice for a weapon that, in the end, offered very little strategic return.
When you hear that 100,000 Reichmarks per rocket, 20,000 lives to build them, what does that tell you about the value Hitler placed on technology versus human life in those final months?
It reveals a total collapse of rational decision-making. It's just psychological obsession. The V2 wasn't designed to destroy the Allied army. It was designed to punish and terrorize civilians, hoping to break the will of the home front. It was a symptom of a regime that had abandoned military pragmatism for just pure nihilistic rage.
The counter-strategies against this new terror were complex, weren't they? The launch sites were mobile, so bombing them was difficult.
Prohibitively costly and often useless. The most successful measure, interestingly enough, was a brilliant psychological operation by British intelligence.
This is where Ultra comes in again.
Well, sort of. Ultra relied on intercepting wireless signals. V2 launch commands weren't sent that way. But British intelligence still played a crucial role by feeding false information back to the Germans through their network of double agents. They sent false impact reports.
So they lied about where the rockets were landing.
Exactly. They exaggerated the impacts in rural areas and minimized the effects in central London. And the Germans, believing this feedback was accurate, adjusted their aiming parameters. They essentially started directing their own V2 rockets into less populated areas.
It didn't stop the terror, but it lessened the impact.
Dramatically. But the terror was still very real. I mean, the V2 made little difference to the outcome of the war, but it was an effective punishment device. There was one explosion at a Woolworths store in London that instantly killed over 150 shoppers and staff. In total, the V2 killed 2,754 British civilians. It completely failed to break their spirit, but it certainly showed that even a wounded Nazi machine could still deliver profound damage.
And it was that wounded machine, fueled by desperation and delusion, that set the stage for our final section. Hitler's last stand, the Ardennes offensive. By late 1944, the Third Reich was actively crumbling.
Even his highest-ranking officers knew the war was lost. The constraints were just immense. They were out of manpower, relying on this patchwork of war veterans and young, unfit recruits. The Luftwaffe was effectively neutralized, and fuel was running dangerously low, especially after the Allies bombed the Romanian oil fields.
Despite all that, Hitler doubled down on irrationality. He knew he couldn't win outright, but he believed he could buy enough time to produce bigger and more powerful weapons.
His whole strategic gamble wasn't about winning the war. It was about splitting the Allies. He calculated that if he could inflict this massive, embarrassing defeat on the Western powers, he could exploit the known tensions between Montgomery and the American generals and force them to splinter away from the Soviets.
Which led to this final plan, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, a return to the Blitzkrieg model.
The objective was daring to the point of insanity. A massive armored thrust to split the American and British lines, drive all the way to the sea, and, crucially, recapture the port of Antwerp.
Recapturing Antwerp would cut off all Allied supplies.
And, theoretically, trap 4 complete armies behind German lines, forcing a negotiated peace in the West. It was a massive roll of the dice. We now know it, of course, as the Battle of the Bulge.
And Hitler insisted on using the Ardennes as the staging area.
He chose it because it had worked so well back in 1940. He believed the Allies, who were focused on the heavy fighting around Aachen, would just dismiss the Ardennes as too rugged for a major armored offensive. They saw it as a quiet sector.
And his own military leaders hated the plan.
Hated it. Field Marshal's model and von Rundstedt, they doubted the feasibility, especially the insane objective of getting all the way to Antwerp. But Hitler was immovable. He insisted the plans go ahead completely unaltered.
And the manpower reality was grim. The plan needed 45 fresh divisions.
And the decimated German army could only muster 30, made up of their last, most desperate reserves. It truly was an all-in gamble.
Fuel shortages pushed the launch date back to December 16th, and they couldn't delay any longer because German intelligence was predicting a major Soviet offensive around December 20th.
He was literally gambling that Stalin would halt his own advance just to watch the chaos unfold in the West. And for this desperate gamble to work, they needed absolute secrecy and a lot of luck. And for a short time, they got both.
The weather.
The weather. When the attack launched, a thick, persistent fog and low cloud ceiling blanketed the entire region. It was a godsend for the Germans. It completely neutralized Allied air support, their biggest threat.
And they managed to circumvent the Allies' greatest intelligence advantage, Ultra. Why was Ultra almost useless here?
Because Ultra relied on intercepting German radio traffic. But since the July 20th plot, German operational security was massively heightened. Communications about the Ardennes offensive were restricted entirely to physical lines, phones, telegraphs, teleprinters.
So there was nothing for Ultra to intercept.
Nothing. And you combine that with night movements, the lack of French resistance networks in the remote Ardennes, and Hitler's master plan quite literally went unnoticed. Allied intelligence warnings were largely ignored.
The surprise was total.
At 5 a.m. on December 16th, a massive, devastating bombardment slammed into the unsuspecting U.S. troops in that quiet sector. The fog actually slowed the German advance, but the shock was enough. Within hours, they'd encircled and forced the surrender of 2 American regiments.
But as the initial shock wore off and the German advance slowed, frustration set in, and that led to this horrific brutality that ultimately backfired on them.
Yes. Hitler had ordered his troops to fight with maximum brutality, to terrify the Americans into surrender. This led to massacres. The most notorious was the Normandy massacre on December 17th.
German forces captured a group of American soldiers who had surrendered. They were herded into a field.
And shot. It was cold, brutal, and completely gratuitous. It gained them no military advantage. If anything, it cost them vital time. The act was later prosecuted as a war crime.
But what's truly pivotal is how that brutality immediately galvanized the American resistance. When news of Normandy spread, any thought of live and let live just evaporated. The U.S. troops became more determined than ever, knowing surrender meant certain death.
And that determination found its ultimate symbol at the key road junction of Bastogne. German forces surrounded the town, surrounded the defending Americans, and demanded immediate surrender.
The letter they sent was pretty ominous.
It warned Brigadier General McAuliffe that failure to comply would result in total annihilation. And it even added this cynical jab about this not corresponding with the well-known American humanity.
And what was the reply sent back to the German commander?
McAuliffe's one-word reply is legendary in military history. He sent the messenger back with a single word on a piece of paper.
Nuts.
Nuts. That reply immediately defined the Allied determination. It was this raw American defiance that resonated across the entire front. It symbolized the absolute refusal to be broken, and it confirmed for Hitler that his dream of a famous last stand began to fade.
And although the Battle of the Bulge wouldn't be resolved until early 1945, the fighting continued relentlessly through Christmas and into the new year, with casualties just rising dramatically on both sides. But that spirit at Bastogne ensured Hitler's last gamble would fail.
And that's where we conclude our deep dive into the end of 1944. A year that started with such high hopes of a quick victory, but ended in this grinding, bloody series of battles, culminating in Hitler's desperate offensive.
The Ardennes offensive really showed that even a cornered Nazi machine could inflict terrible damage. But the strategic reality of the war, the capture of Antwerp, the logistical success, it all made the final push for Berlin inevitable. And that inevitability was looming, even as the days of the 3 great allies, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin working together, were drawing to a close. Now, before we leave you to think over the details of this violent pivotal period, if you found this deep dive into the sheer logistics and desperation of the war compelling, we invite you to support the kind of in-depth historical exploration we do here by checking out our War Stories merchandise. You can find my shop link in the description below.
Absolutely. And as we close the books on 1944, it leaves us with a provocative thought. We've seen a regime willing to sacrifice its own greatest hero, Rommel, and commit 20,000 slave laborers to their deaths just to build the V2. We've seen the staggering attrition in the Hürtgen Forest, where Allied casualties were double the German count, all to secure some strategic dams. So considering the true value of a strategic objective versus the desperation of a collapsing regime, where does the calculus of cost truly lie in the final stages of a total war? That's something to ponder as we look ahead to the final bloody months of the conflict,